In this episode of Watercolor Florals, I'll show you step by step how to paint one of the internet's favorite flowers, the peony. Okay, let's start today's project with a really quick supply rundown. So I'm using Canson hot press paper on a block, which means it's basically stretched for me. I've got my koi set from Sakura. This is the 48 pan watercolor set. I also have 2 glasses of clean water, some paper for blotting. We'll talk colors in a second, and then I have various brushes. So, brushes today. We are using synthetic round brushes. Number 8 is the large one, then a number 4 and a 5. Now these round brushes, they have a large belly where you can hold a lot of paint, but then they come to a very fine tip or fine point, which is great for doing detail work, but also for laying down big splotches of color. And we'll get into why that's important when we paint. Now, for the colors that I'm mixing up, for the main pink of the peonies, I'm mixing this sort of peachy pink. It's a little bit of red, a little bit of peach, a little bit of white, and lots of water. I've also mixed up a really dark, deep magenta. It's a little bit of magenta, red, and purple mixed together. Whatever color you choose to use for your peonies, you'll need a lighter version and a darker, so it could be orange and peach, and you'll need green. Now, we are just going to jump right in and start by painting our first peony. I'm using the light pink, and I'm going to do sort of an oval shape. And then on both sides of that oval, I'll begin to do these semicircular wide brush strokes. And that's where I'm using the belly of the brush and I drag it across the page to get these semicircles to extend my circle. And then I use the tip of the brush to continue those semicircles and sort of close in the circle along the top, if that makes sense. So the peony, at least the peonies that I see most often, are those really tight peonies that are just a big ball of petals. They're like a tennis ball of petals. And they're that wonderful light fuchsia. That's sort of the classic peony that comes to my mind. So that's what I'm trying to paint here. Now, it's a very circular flower, but I don't want to paint a perfect circle because that will just look weird. So let's start another one here really close up and we'll go through it together. We're starting with the oval and then these big, wide, semicircular brush strokes, very imperfect, just done by dragging the body of the brush. And then we use the tip of the brush to kind of fill in the top of the circle with these tiny thin brush strokes. And I'm leaving lots of negative space you can see between brush strokes, and that's just to give the look of layers of petals, of light hitting the peony from above. So leave those white areas. You want to see the page showing through. And then towards the bottom of the peony, you can continue with these wider brush strokes, and the petals can even fall away from that circular form as they do. So now while these are still wet, we're going to take our green, and it's up to you if you want to use a warm green or a cool green. I'm using kind of a dark minty green today. And we are going to do a stem, and we're also going to do some little sort of jagged, scraggly leaves right around the base of the flower where it meets the stem. So they just sort of poke out from beneath this large round flower. And because we are doing this while the flowers are still wet, we may get a nice bleeding of the pink and the green. And the first one, I didn't really get any of that. It had mostly dried, so I'll get a little bit of color mix here on the second one, and I like that. I just think that looks so nice and natural. Any color blending like that we would call wet into wet watercolor painting, because 2 wet colors or 2 wet areas of paint are mixing. And right now we are just laying down our first layer of paint for these peonies. So we're allowing the paint to blend slightly, but a lot of this painting we are going to create through a wet on dry technique. So we're just laying down our base layer right now, and then we're going to come back in once a lot of this paint has dried, and that's when we're really going to add the detail. So right now, when you're focusing on these leaves and these flowers, you just want to think about the shape, and you want to make sure that you capture some of that negative space. So don't worry too much right now about shading. Just worry about the shape. You want this fat, rounded peony. You want negative space. You want to see those lines where the petals are or where the light might be hitting. So leave a little bit of page showing through. You can add a little extra paint. That's that wet into wet technique, but you don't need to do a lot of shading. And yes, it's great if you can get the green and the pink to blend a little where the leaves hit the petals. Wonderful, but don't worry about that if you're painting slow and you miss it like I did on the first flower. No big deal. We're going to add so much magic and punch to this painting with a wet onto dry technique. So we're going to allow this whole first layer to dry. Now on this last flower here, you can see me just blending together the pink and the green, and I'll flip this page around. Sometimes I find it's easier to paint petals if I'm pulling the brush towards me. I can move the brush in a more natural motion, more natural for me. So move the page as you need to. Add a few leaves along the length of each stem, and of course you've got the leaves poking out from the bottom of each flower. We are quickly coming to the end of what I would call sort of the first layer of this painting, the first portion, which is all that wet into wet, where we're working with wet paint. We're going to let this dry. It doesn't take long. Most of this painting is already dry, except maybe that last flower. And we are going to mix up a very dark green. So this is, I've used Hooker's green, Payne's gray, and just a little bit of sap green. And I have this very almost black green, and it's going to give me some wonderful contrast within this piece. So here's where we start having fun. You can see when I lay down this wet paint onto the layer that's already there, it's not blending with it at all because the paint on the page is already dry. So this allows me to create some really striking contrast within the piece. You can see I just used the belly of the brush to just add a splotch of color here and a splotch of color there. I might bleed it out a little with a clean wet brush, but it gives a wonderful amount of contrast. I've got a dark green on the page, but now I'm adding almost this black green, and I'm just adding it to portions of some of the leaves. I'm not overthinking it. I will add maybe a line down the center of a few of the leaves, and you can see this wonderful detail and definition and contrast that I achieved through doing this. And it's not hard. This is coming back in once the first layer is already dry and adding the detail wherever you want to. And you can move slow and you can think about it a lot, or you can just put a splotch of that black green wherever you want, and you don't need to overthink it. So this is really fun, and you have to get a little bit brave. You have to be able to say, I'm gonna place this really rich green on top. And now, this is the part I'm scared of. We are going to mix up some deep magenta. This is red and magenta and purple mixed together. And then I'm gonna mix that into my light pink. And I'm going to create shades of dark pink, and I'm going to do the same thing to the flowers. This is wet on dry. We are taking our wet dark paint and we are going to add some shading, some petals to these big round tennis ball flowers. So you can see that here I'm still using a semicircular brush stroke, dragging the brush across the page, adding deeper color, adding more pink, and it's a little bit scary, but like I said, you gotta be brave. We're gonna do it. We're going to add this deep, rich black green, and we're going to add this wonderful magenta, dark pink, and we're going to really make these flowers pop. You can use smaller brush strokes along the top of the flower, and then you want to leave the highlight right in the top center. Not right at the top because it's a rounded object, so the highlight won't look right if it's right along the top. The shadow sort of needs to encircle the entire flower just slightly, if that makes sense. And here we're going to go for it again. I'm using the belly of the brush. I drag it across the page with bravery and confidence. And we are adding this really nice, rich pink to our very, very light pink. And it's by using a color palette with such high contrast, such a bold color palette, that we, I think, capture the look of the peony and also create a painting that is quite sophisticated, that has a real sophistication. Oh, I just, as I said that, I just got some droplets of paint on my page. This can be a little scary because of course we can't paint over watercolors, but you can take a clean dry brush and sop up the paint and then use a wet clean brush to kind of bleed the stain out or smear it a little and then hit it with an eraser once it's dry. You'll never notice it. Now for this final peony, I am doing a really rich pink in the center at the top, and I'm using that wonderful magenta, and I am just adding this very dark pink, bleeding it out with a bit of clean water and a bit of peachy pink towards the bottom of the flower. Now the other ones I had done the highlight in the top middle. This one I am doing a sort of a low light. This would be a peony where it has those wonderfully dense, really dark petals in the center. So I'm kind of doing two different kinds or two different shapes of peonies within this one piece. So I am just giving it my best and really trying not to overthink the act of putting on this much darker paint. And once you put it on the page, at a certain point you got to leave it alone. Just like I always say, don't overwork your paints, make those bold strokes and then leave it alone. Semicircular or curving strokes are a good idea. It's going to make the flower appear very bulbous and round and fat. So make those brush strokes curved, make them wide, make them messy and perfectly imperfect, and you're going to get this. Use a color palette with lots of contrast, whether it's pink or peach or purple, and I think you'll really get the hang of the peony in no time. Thank you guys so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As usual, patrons of the channel can print my peony watercolor. All the high-res JPEGs of the artwork that you see are available on my Patreon site, so go check that out after today's video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon with a new tutorial.